Previously on CSI Starbase.
You know this isn't gonna stop our investigation, right? All right, you guys do what you need to do up there. We'll figure something else out. Apparently SpaceX is having some sort of all hands on deck meeting, which clearly we weren't invited to. This is what I'm expecting the first 4 tower sections to look like the day they are lifted into place. You can see here that there's just a tiny gap left over between the pipes where the couplings can be installed to connect each section together. I feel like it's probably not a good idea to leave these gigantic holes open in the outside of the launch table once everything is finalized. This is where a skirt that encloses the entire walkway would come in handy.
If I see any more signs that SpaceX is gonna throw some more clothes on this naked launch mount, I promise I'm gonna be the first ones to let you guys know.
The purpose of these cameras is actually to allow for automation of the chopsticks without humans standing on the launch mount. By the way, these cameras were not fully installed until after the second full stack test, so that is likely one of the many reasons that they haven't used the chopsticks yet to stack a booster.
Welcome to CSI Starbase.
I'm gonna put that in my pocket.
Agent Allan, what can I do you for?
Zach, how are you doing, man? Where are you right now?
I'm just walking back to headquarters right now, man. It's hot out here.
Listen, I want you to check this out on your way up there. I've finally figured out what all the hands on deck meeting from last week was about.
Don't remind me, man. I was way off on that one. When I posted that tweet last week showing them clear all that space in front of the high bay, I really thought that was the end of the road for that Buckner LR 11,000. I even followed up with an obituary featuring all of his greatest hits. Come to find out, they were actually just clearing up space for that exclusive presentation. So what did Elon say anyways? Coast is clear, full send?
Well, actually, we have no idea what he said. There was no speech to go along with it, but it appears he released a slide deck to go along with the announcement.
Are you serious?
Well, yeah, but we should be able to fill in some of the blanks ourselves, though, right?
Well, that is what we do here. All right, man, I'll be up there in a minute. All right, Geoff, just getting to the office now. Give me 1 second and I'll transfer you up to the big screen. Before we get started, I missed a call from Max Q on the way up here, so go ahead and patch him through.
Oh yeah, sure. Hold on.
Agent Q, good to see you. What do you have for us today?
Hey, Golden Boy. There's something going on at the tank farm you should have a look at.
Oh, really? All right, go ahead and play it. Oh, shut the front door. Are you serious? Man, if what I'm seeing is correct, then we have yet another major change happening at the tank farm. This is like the 4th one. I mean, it looks to me like they're about to convert those abandoned methane tanks into additional lock storage. I had a feeling this was going to happen when I saw them remove the manifold that was responsible for joining the 2 tanks together last week. As of now, SpaceX has started laying out new pipes, which have already been connected to both tanks and appear to be headed towards the liquid oxygen side of the farm. Before we jump the gun on this one though, we're going to need to figure out exactly what's going on here. We are either about to have 4 liquid nitrogen tanks and 3 liquid oxygen, or 2 liquid nitrogen and 5 liquid oxygen. Once we know the full scope of this changeover, we can adjust our Orbital Tank Farm deep dive explanation accordingly. Oh man, I swear, it gets harder and harder to keep up with SpaceX pretty much every single week. Anyways, Geoff, go ahead and run that all hands on deck slideshow. I don't know, man. There's not a whole lot to gain here. I mean, don't get me wrong, the graphics are great, and the Starlink Pez dispenser looks absolutely hilarious when it's sped up 1,000%, but there isn't a whole lot to investigate here that won't already be covered by the Team Space news media. I mean, you know Marcus House is gonna be all over this one. The guy literally talks about the entire global space industry every single week in less than a half hour. And he does it all without breathing. Pretty sure he's a bot.
Yeah, keep that to yourself. At least we'll know what the Starfactory might look like.
Good point. This actually answers a lot of questions for us, especially when it relates to how we should expect SpaceX to proceed with the remainder of the factory's construction. The first section of the factory is close to being finished, and once the roof is on, I'm sure it won't take long to install all of the electrical utilities and then move all of the workstations out of one of these 3 mushroom tents over to the new space.
In order to avoid any interruptions to production during the remaining construction process, they're going to have to be smart about their logistical decisions during phases 2 and 3. If we look back at the render that SpaceX provided, we can see one version of the Starfactory, which will be located at the Roberts Road facility, followed by the equivalent factory also under construction at Starbase. In the Starbase version, we can see that the side of the building closest to the highway is tall enough to stack nose cones in. I think it's actually going to be pretty awesome being able to see inside of the glass windows of this building when you're driving past the facilities at night. Unfortunately, Mr. Elon did not include a full view of what the Starbase version of the factory will look like when it's completed, but it's all good because thankfully, 3D forensics agents Too Legit to Quit and Lola Matico 3D were able to quickly put this render together just for this week's episode in order to demonstrate what the facility will look like when it's finished. It's important to note that the taller section of the building has a flat roof while the remaining 2/3 feature a sloped ceiling, which means the overhead space for stacking operations will increase as you move closer to the Highway 4 side of the factory. If you look at this photo Mauricio took from the ground drill perspective, you can easily see the slope in the roof of this building. Anyways, up until this point, I think it's been pretty much assumed that SpaceX would disassemble the tents sequentially from right to left, one at a time as they build out the remaining sections of the Starfactory. This means that the first one to be transferred over would be tent number 3, which is the nose cone tent. But I'm not so sure. I think that might be a little difficult to pull off. It really helps to refer back to the first everyday astronaut tour of Starbase when discussing which parts of the manufacturing process are located in each tent. With that being said, as soon as Tim walks through the door with Big E, we can immediately see that at least 3 nose cones are under construction. There are several rail-mounted gantry cranes of various sizes along the left wall. This is where they are stored when they aren't in use to allow for ring sections to travel up the middle of the tent. Beyond that, we can see 2 larger freestanding bridge cranes in the background. One on the far right and another in the middle, which nearly touches the roof. A large overhead crane like this, which is used for stacking nose cones, is going to need all the space it can get. So in order to make it fit inside of here, SpaceX had to construct the tent on top of 2 rows of shipping containers. Tents 1 and 2 are the exact same as this one, except they only have 1 row of containers. This gives tent number 3 an additional 3 meters of height in comparison to the other 2. Moving over to tent 2, we can see that there is much less equipment under this structure. There are a pair of 10-ton gantry cranes sitting on rails, which allow them to move back and forth across the entire length of the tent. I would assume that there's even more of these in here now, but that doesn't really matter because these aren't very difficult to relocate. Moving forward through the tent, we can see a lot of small workstations for tank domes and transport stands to go along with them, which are also easily moved via forklifts. Finally, let's take a look into tent number 1, keeping in mind that this tour took place close to a year ago and things have likely changed, but not by much. Most folks probably remember the flock of raptors living near the front entrance, but it's also important to note how much open space there is inside of this building. As Tim continues to look around, we can see that there are several tank sections in here as we would expect. Each of them are resting on a small transport stand as well, but there aren't any overhead lifting structures or permanent workstations, just a single 5-ton gantry crane in the center of the tent. Now that we've been through all 3, the logistics of this situation are becoming a lot more clear. In order to remove Tent 3 and continue Starfactory construction, SpaceX would first have to remove all of the contents of Tent 1 over to the new factory, then lift each tent section up one by one and add 12 additional shipping containers to give it the height required. So in my opinion, the only real solution here is to move the contents of tent number 1 and 2 over to the new factory space at the same time. Given how much open space there was in tent 1, both of these should fit in the first section of the Starfactory pretty easily, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. With that being said, this means the next section of the Texas Starfactory to break ground will have to be the tallest section of the building. With the third section of the Starfactory complete, the contents of the nose cone tent can be transferred over and continue operations, while the middle portion of the structure is constructed last. This is the only way I can think of for SpaceX to upgrade this facility without experiencing any delays in production. Thanks again to Too Legit to Quit and Lola Matico 3D for putting this render together for today's investigation. Make sure to follow them both on Twitter if you guys haven't already. So changing the subject a little bit, I've been keeping my eyes on something I noticed on the floor of the existing Starfactory. I think this might give us a better clue of what we should expect to see inside of this structure once it's finally got a roof over its head. If you look closely, you can see little square patches on the floor throughout the building located between the structural columns which divide the factory into 3 aisles. I expected these might be additional columns to support the roof when I first discovered them, but it's becoming more clear that isn't the case. When we look at an older image of this taken before the structural steelwork had gotten underway, it's easier to see the pattern of where these concrete embedded column posts are located. I can't really explain why, but I have a feeling these are supposed to be grouped into sets of 4. If that is the case, once we outline the posts, we can see what we're left with appears to be 3 rows of 5 workstations for 15 in total. It took me a while to figure out what exactly would go in these locations until I had the chance to go back through that everyday astronaut tour in the process of conducting this investigation. In Tents 1 and 2, I didn't really find anything that was large enough to take up the space in these 15 workstations. We saw several 5 and 10-ton PF series gantry cranes, but these were mounted onto tracks. I guess you could remove the casters and bolt it directly to the ground. However, I don't think these cranes have a large enough footprint to fit into the spaces that we showed before. If we go back into Tent 3 though, there's 2 much larger freestanding bridge cranes that I mentioned earlier. The one closest to the entrance is extremely tall, likely for nose cone work, while the smaller one was likely used for booster sections. Just like the PF series cranes, these have the ability to be mounted directly to the ground. If we back this footage up a bit, you can see that a little more clearly. These casters can easily be separated from the rest of the frame. These gantries have a much larger stance than the former ones I mentioned. I'm not sure if we will see more of this kind in particular, but I think it will be something similar. This crane was actually removed from the nose cone tent several months ago and is now sitting in the Sanchez lot, abandoned alongside all of the other garbage. The reason I think we will see more of this type of crane is because this one in particular is much different than normal gantry cranes. This piece of the crane that we're looking at here actually functions as a load spreader for the ring sections, which eliminates an extra part that would be needed otherwise. I think that SpaceX may have an upgraded version of this now. However, we never got a look into the fab tents on the most recent EDA tour, so unfortunately there's no way for us to know for sure. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more information about this as soon as they start moving all of the equipment into the new workspace.
Anyways, let's move on to some more exciting developments, Geoff. Something with a little bit more of an immediate impact on the Starship program.
Indian Star had an idea.
Oh, really? All right, yeah, go ahead, put her through. Agent Star, good to see you.
Hey, GB. Are you excited for the mitigated Fonzie report? I'm sure we're going to have to cover it this week, right?
Absolutely not. You know that the only 3-letter agency that I care about is the one that I'm sitting in. Plus, I actually read through the entire thing, and for the most part, it seems like all the recommended actions have either been completed or they're already in progress. So I don't know, I feel like SpaceX has this one under control.
The only thing of interest that directly relates to any of our ongoing investigations was this part about the need for SpaceX to incorporate Raptor protection measures into project design and any above-ground utility upgrades. Interesting choice of words calling them Raptors here, but in this case referring to the feathered kind, not the R2s. For example, SpaceX would equip structures with devices to discourage nest building and perching. This would be our first sign that the naked launch mount is about to receive some more outer paneling. I guess I'm not the only one who thinks we need to cover up these huge holes in order to prevent all of the flying creatures of Boca Chica from setting up shop in there. I hope this proposed action item might also pertain to the orbital launch tower. I mean, think about it. If we look at Tim Dodd's most recent tour through the launch tower, there are an incredible amount of little nooks and crannies all over the place that would be pretty ideal for a bird's nest.
Well, this is not a good place if you have a fear of heights, that's for sure.
Yeah, but it's like f***ing paradise if you're a young grackle looking to settle down, get married, and have some kids. Especially on all the levels of the tower that don't have crew access platforms like this one, where someone may actually walk by and see it. Keep in mind that more than 70% of the tower is completely inaccessible without setting up a very large amount of scaffolding first. So fingers crossed SpaceX begins to enclose this tower soon after the first few static fire tests.
Speaking of that, Booster 7 should be rolling back out to the launch complex soon, right? Do you think they'll use the chopsticks this time to do the lifting?
You know, Indy, that's actually a really great question. I'm glad you asked. In my opinion, we should know the answer to that pretty much immediately when it rolls back out of the Mega Bay again. But instead of giving away the answer, let's talk about why they haven't used the chopsticks to lift a booster yet. You know, I was actually kind of grateful that Booster 7 didn't roll out this week, so I had a chance to explain what we should be on the lookout for. You never know if they're gonna roll it out and then lift it in the same day. That's why I posted that poll on Twitter to see how many people thought it was gonna be a booster rollout instead of 7.1. I tend to post things like that a lot just to give people a hint about cases that we're working on for the next episode.
So, why has SpaceX been able to use these to lift a Starship, but not the booster? Well, in my opinion, most of the reasons are related to the fact that this procedure has to be performed autonomously without humans present. That's easy enough to do on the Starship, but the booster suffers from an issue that the Starship doesn't have to deal with. And that problem is 33 engines hanging below the skirt of the vehicle. The Starship, on the other hand, has all of its engines tucked into the skirt, so there is no worry of them colliding with the transport stand as it's lifted off. To explain this further, we have to look back at Starship Gazer's live stream of the last Booster 4 stack on the OLM. This is seriously one of my favorite videos of all time.
If you guys want to see the full version of this video, then you can find it in the description along with a link to Starship Gazer's Patreon. It's really important to make sure that we support all the photographers on the ground who bring us all this amazing footage, because without it, you guys would be stuck looking at my face the entire time, and that makes it really hard to understand a lot of these concepts that we're talking about.
Anyways, as you can see, when the booster is released from the clamps, it immediately starts to wobble around, whether there is wind or not. This is a major issue that requires workers to hold it in place using straps attached to the side of the vehicle. It takes a long time for them to safely lift this out of the transport stand. This same issue exists on the launch mount as well, although it's not as bad because the clamps retract much further away. Thanks to 3D forensics agent Ryan Hansen Space, we can see what this looks like from below. It's pretty obvious that there isn't a whole lot of room for error down here. After watching the booster stacking, I was convinced that SpaceX was going to need to do something to combat this issue. When I examined Booster 4 a little bit closer, I noticed that there was an indentation on the side of the HPU cover, which we originally thought was for some kind of sensor. I hadn't told anyone at the time, but I had a feeling that this feature of the HPU cover might not be a sensor at all, and instead might be intended to interface with this piece of equipment that Starship Gazer had taken a photo of sometime in the middle of February. It looked like a doorknob mounted onto a hydraulic ram or something. On top of that, I noticed a mounting bracket of some sort had been added onto the Orbital Launch Mount on the 19th of February, as shown here by RGV Ground Drill. So on the 21st of February, I took a surprise trip to Starbase for my birthday because I wanted to investigate this item in person. Getting a first-hand view of a super heavy booster on the Orbital Launch Mount was going to be a plus as well. My flight ended up getting delayed about 5 hours, so I knew I wasn't going to make it out to the site that day. But while I was sitting in the airport, I received a message from CSI Starbase agent Max Q that something pretty large had been lifted onto the launch mount that night, but he wasn't really able to see what it was. Luckily, I knew what it was without even having to see it, but I wanted to get some proof before I said anything. So the very next day, I left the hotel super early and drove out to Starbase, straight past the recently upgraded rocket garden and the new high bay under construction, and instead went to the dome yard where I knew the object of interest was previously being stored. When I got there, however, it was gone. So immediately I hopped back in the car and drove straight to the launch site. I wasn't able to get a very good picture due to the inferior quality of my camera, but using some high-power binoculars the next day, I was able to get a close enough view to be able to see exactly what it was. Thanks to these binoculars, I was able to get the first close-up images of this booster stabilization pin after it was installed. Once I got back to the hotel and finally had time to post these pictures to Twitter, I started thinking to myself, I bet they're probably going to need this on the transport stand as well. I scrolled back through my photos from the day before to look for Booster 4's transport stand, which had been moved back to the Sanchez site for some reason, but unfortunately, it didn't look any different than it had before. This was a bit disappointing to me at first. Why would they move the transport stand all the way over here if not for this reason? Anyways, the next few days were pretty miserable thanks to the rain and dense fog, so I didn't go out to Starbase because I knew there wouldn't be much happening. So on my 4th night in Brownsville, I was just about to hit the sheets when I received a call from Maria Pointer, aka Boca Chica Maria, who was letting me borrow her iconic Nissan Pathfinder during my trip. She was asking me why I wasn't out at the site. I looked out the front door and I said, well, it's almost midnight, plus the weather's looking kind of bummy right now and I think it's about to start raining. We talked for a while longer, and before we got off the phone, she reminded me that times like these when you think nothing is happening is actually when you're most likely to miss the most. I knew she was right, so I got dressed, hopped in the Nissan, and started making my way out there. I was just about to pass the Starbase sign when something on the left side of the road caught my eye, causing me to slam on the brakes and pull over. Pretty crazy timing, as these workers had just finished setting up new scaffolding near Booster 4's transport stand. Once I saw this, I just couldn't leave. I sat outside for hours that night watching these guys work in the rain to get this transport stand ready. We didn't talk, but I feel like we really bonded. Work continued on this transport stand for several days, and this is what it looked like when I left Starbase for the final time on that trip. Because I wasn't able to see the final product, when I got back to Chicago, I had Lab Padre's Raptor Roost Cam trained on this thing every single day, despite requests from people in the chat who wanted to see the wideband construction. Sorry guys. Well, my patience was finally rewarded when I saw this happen live and took a recording of it. This camera is extremely far away and I wasn't sure if my eyes were playing tricks, so I called Starship Gazer immediately, who happened to be on his way out there at the time. I was like, bruh, I need you to get a close-up of this ASAP. Luckily, he arrived just in time to catch them while they were still partially extended. Thanks to this awesome animation by Ryan Hansen Space, we can visualize how these stabilizer pins function to keep the booster from wobbling around as it's being lifted out of the transport stand. You might think the height that these extend to is a bit excessive, but the reason these extend so far out is to move the engine bells not only past the clamps, but also past the future walking platform which SpaceX most likely anticipated adding to the transport stands as they were designing this mechanism. The crew platform I'm referring to was first seen installed on the Booster 5 transport stand. This was either a prototype version or a sign that we should not expect Booster 5 to stay here forever. This walking platform is being added to all 5 of SpaceX's booster transport stands, which can be seen here on the new one that was constructed for Booster 8. These platforms will likely have handrails added to them later, and I'm sure this guy is really looking forward to that. This upgrade will make it so he doesn't have to climb on top of each of these clamps as seen here and constantly clip onto the structure for safety and then unclip himself again anytime he needs to move around onto one of the other clamp holders. I'm assuming these stabilizer pins have been installed on B7's transport stand while it's been in the Mega Bay getting all 33 Raptor 2s installed. Last week they were spotted just near the last remaining roof section for the new structure. These have since disappeared, so I believe we will see them mounted onto Booster 7's transport stand once it decides to roll out the door. In other good news, after months of waiting, we finally spotted SpaceX testing out the equivalent stabilizer pins on the Orbital Launch Mount. So now that this is confirmed to be working and all 20 cameras on top of the launch mount are fully wired up as well, there is a high probability that the Chopsticks will lift Booster 7 onto the launch mount when it arrives. For the first time ever, we can now clearly see the shielded cables that run to each of the cameras on top of the launch mount. These two things together are extremely important for SpaceX to be able to operate the Chopsticks without humans standing nearby. As we've seen in the past, when SpaceX uses the Chopsticks, they shut down the entire highway and clear the pad of all personnel before commencing operations. Even the transport stands will have cameras on it to assist with this maneuver. This will be needed most when moving the booster from the launch mount back to the transport stand. Unfortunately, even though all of these systems are now up and running, I don't want to get people's hopes up too high because there's still a possibility that the Chopsticks won't actually be ready in time for the next lift. I say this because there was one additional reason that SpaceX didn't use the Chopsticks to lift the booster. That reason is because of this mechanism right here. Without it, the sticks would be unable to adjust the positioning of the booster after they lift it off of the transport stand or the launch mount. I think a lot of people may have assumed that this system was already up and running, but in reality, these pusher pins, as I like to refer to them as, never moved more than a few inches away from this position until May of 2022. The reason for this is because SpaceX has a giant mobile crawler crane on site that's capable of lifting a booster onto the launch mount, but they aren't capable of lifting a Starship by any other means other than the Chopsticks. So I think their main focus was on getting the systems needed for lifting a Starship up and running before anything else. This is why for close to 8 months, the only scaffolding we saw in the Chopsticks was located in the center of the arm surrounding the Starship lifting pins shown here. The second mechanical system needed for lifting a Starship is the stabilization arm. Once this was up and running, they were able to divert their attention to other areas of the tower like the SQD arm, which needed to be upgraded in order to work with the new generation of Starships. Other than those two things, nothing else really mattered. The reason I can say this with such certainty is because it wasn't until after May of this year when additional scaffolding to work on the linear actuator systems was finally added onto the Chopsticks. For over a month they worked on this and we didn't see any movement out of it until May 18th when Mauricio from RGVAerial caught one of them in the fully extended position from the air, and also later that day from the ground drill angle. It wasn't until these were fully extended that I finally realized the purpose of these small arrowhead-looking protrusions on the front of the Chopsticks. The purpose of this is for the pusher pins to rest on it when they're fully extended. Why is this important for them to be able to extend so far away? Well, the reason is because the push pins have to be able to extend all the way past the end of the landing rail in order for this feature of the Chopsticks to work as shown here by Oa from SpaceX 3D Eccentric. The pusher pins have to be 100% clear of the rail because they aren't attached to the landing rail at all. In a way, they actually function as a locking mechanism that prevents the landing rail from moving from its resting position. We haven't fully determined what type of mechanism will be used to actuate this 4-bar linkage, which lifts the rail up and down, but we do know it hasn't been installed as of yet. I'm pretty sure that some kind of piston might eventually be mounted in these locations shown here. I don't think we'll have to wait long to find out though, because it appears that SpaceX might be in the process of adding these as we speak, given a few interesting additions that we've noticed on the carriage that the Chopsticks are mounted to. Late last week, this piece of equipment arrived to the launch complex and our CSI agents immediately jumped on the case to figure out what it was. After a close analysis, we determined that this is likely 6 large hydraulic piston accumulators with adjustable force gas springs. That was quite a large mouthful, but think of it as a large shock absorbing system like this one CSI Starbase agent Dave Avery was kind enough to draw up for us. Basically, when force is applied to the piston on the right, the accumulator shown in the middle will absorb that force. The gas balance spring in the system is adjustable as well, thanks to the high-pressure gas supply and vent. There aren't too many places something like this will be used other than the booster catching mechanism that we spoke about earlier. As the booster lands on the rails, these 5 pistons which lift the rail up would compress and allow for a softer landing. If that's the case, then I expect that this accumulator would get mounted somewhere on the chopsticks. Sure enough, in this clip from Starship Gazer's livestream, you can see several new pipes added on the carriage. And if you look closely, you can see the new gas spring system as it was being lifted into place. I wasn't sure if Starship Gazer knew this was in the background, but when I asked, he offered to drive out to Starbase just to take this picture for us. So it turns out that instead of being inside of the tower, this accumulator is mounted directly to the carriage. I'm expecting a second one will arrive soon and be mounted in the same location but on the opposite side. This would equal out the weight on both sides of the carriage and give each arm its own spring-loaded dampening system to absorb all the remaining kinetic energy from the booster as it lands on the chopstick rails.
Man, this place never gets old. I feel like I could talk about Starbase Texas pretty much all day. But I think we should probably address some of these Starbase Kennedy updates as well, especially since that first tower section has already moved down the road and already been stacked onto the tower base.
Anyone who happened to watch one of the first CSI Starbase investigations that we released about a month ago has likely been expecting cryotubing, electrical conduit, and mechanical pipework to be installed into the new tower sections at SpaceX Roberts Road facility before they are transported. This is the reason that the 5th tower section was constructed out of order, so that SpaceX could get a head start on assembling the internal organs of Mechazilla. As I mentioned in that episode, it's important to complete the construction of this tower in record time while also competing with regular Falcon 9 launches from Pad 39A. It would be necessary to pre-install everything they possibly could this time around. Looking at this footage from Spaceflight Now, taken while the first of 9 sections was moved to the KSC launch complex a few days ago, you can see that all of the systems that I lifted off a few seconds ago did in fact end up getting installed into the first OLIT section. One of the first things I noticed was that the cryotubes have been moved to the opposite side of the tower. Wow. Praise the Lord. Looks like we won't be catching super heavy boosters right above the propellant carrying cryotubes like at Starbase. Knowing where the cryotubes enter the tower could help us predict where the rest of the components of the tank farm will be located at the launch site. In this shot taken last week by Greg Scott, we can see the first tower section once it arrived. There is also now a very large cylindrical structure being constructed behind the launch tower. It's insane how many people have tagged me on Twitter asking me what this is. I originally planned to hold off on commenting on this one, but after watching the Falcon 9 launch this week, we noticed something during the countdown as the cameras shifted to show what would be the new Starship launch tower, if not for Booster 1060's big ass head in the way. Just off to the left, you can see 2 extremely large rings being welded together on the ground. We have measured these out to be roughly 20 meters in diameter. That's 8 meters wider than the cryo shows at Starbase. Given the proximity of this ring assembly area to the location of the mystery structure, I think it's safe to assume that these 2 are related to each other. There is a good possibility that this is for future propellant storage, but there are a lot more questions here than answers. Do these rings go around the cylindrical frame or on top of it? If this is a cryo shell, then where is the interior tank and how large will that one be? If there is no interior tank, then I assume this is for water and not cryo storage, so are we going to have a real deluge system here? I'm sure we'll get some answers in the coming weeks, but for now, let's get back on topic. Next up, we have the mechanical pipework shown here. These pipes are responsible for delivering several commodities to the 5th section of the tower. It's hard to tell which is which, but if we refer back to the image from RGV Aerial showing the same pipe rack on the first orbital launch tower before it was installed, we can see 14 different pipes of various sizes attached to these racks. This likely includes everything you see here on this labeled diagram of the Starship quick disconnect panel, except for the cryogenic liquid oxygen and methane fill and drain ports. This is a pretty large amount of cables entering into Section 1, with the remainder going into Section 5 as shown in these shots from Starship Gazer. It was awesome to see these cable racks pre-installed into the tower sections as well in this shot from HawkX on Twitter. This is a lot more prefabrication than a lot of people were expecting to take place, but in my opinion, there are a lot more surprises like this to come. As I mentioned in episode 3, the most complicated out of all tower sections is the 5th one, and that's going to require a lot more work. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what's included here, because all anyone needs to do is go watch the Everyday Astronaut video when he gets off the elevator on the 5th section, and you can easily see how much equipment is located on this level. I do expect everything, and I do mean everything, to be pre-installed before this section moves down the highway. We should see the same for the massive GSE arm that hangs off the side of the tower. I think by the time it arrives, it will be completed to the point that all we have to do is add in the swivel joints that connect the insulated cryopipes to the tower. In this view from Starship Gazer, you can see what I expect the QD arm to look like within hours of it being lifted into place. The missing swivel joints that allow the pipes to rotate with the GSE arm while the tower remains stationary are shown here. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any sightings of this GSE arm yet at the Roberts Road facility. What we have spotted, however, is the first pieces of the Chopsticks from Mechazilla 2 arriving on site at the Roberts Road facility, as you can see here in this flyover shot from Greg Scott. It's a bit odd that the first components of the Chopsticks to arrive at Starbase Kennedy are also the last components to get fully installed on the first tower in Starbase, Texas. Anyways, I think that's enough about Mechazilla for one day. There's actually something I'm a little bit more concerned with, and I think a lot of people at home will agree with this one as well. Where is the Orbital Launch Mount? About the only information we have at this point is that construction has most likely started thanks to some overhead images posted by Harry Stranger on Twitter. This photo shows 4 sections which are likely for the Starbase Kennedy launch mount outside of SpaceX's Hangar M facility. Other than that, this is about all the information that we have. With this being said, I figure maybe we can use our knowledge of how the first launch mount was constructed and assume that SpaceX will likely take major steps to improve on the construction process of its second OLM the same way they have with the tower. I'm going to go pretty deep into this one, so I apologize if we lose anybody along the way. I'm sure the public will let me know how they feel about this in the comments once this investigation, or should I say in speculation, goes live.
You know, Geoff, I'm not really sure how to proceed with this one. What if this is all just way too much information?
No, man, that's what we're all about. Deep dives.
Well, you know, if they like deep dives, then I say this time we go deep, deep.
Whoa, are those gloves green?
Yes, sir, they sure are.
You probably don't want to use those ones.
Come on, man. Quit being a weirdo. I got these from work. I'm pretty sure it'll be fine.
Let's start with a little background info on how this launch mount was constructed so that people who have no idea what we're talking about here will get a better understanding. The first signs we ever had of the orbital launch mount at Starbase came when RGVAerial did this flyover on February 2nd of 2021. You can see that these 51-inch platforms were laid out in a pattern that would later allow for the launch mount pizza slices to be elevated in a position so that workers could get underneath them for an intense amount of welding work that would later take place. These images from Dayton Koslow were one of the first appearances of the launch mount slices I just mentioned. It takes 10 of these to complete a full ring. The section we are looking at here is a centered version, or common section as I usually refer to it by. 6 out of the 10 slices are C-sections just like this one. I did a pretty long article about this on Twitter back in December from last year, so I'm going to borrow some images from that early version of this investigation. This is a left split section. Highlighted here in yellow is an additional vertical plate in the middle of the left compartment. There are 3 shelves on the back wall of the right compartment, which aren't present on the left as a result of this yellow wall. 2 out of the 10 sections are left split or LS sections, just like this one. As you can probably already imagine, there is also a right split version, which is a mirror image of the left split. Simple enough, right? Keep these in mind as we go, because the reason for the 3 different versions will become apparent soon. So, as these sections began to arrive, they were quickly lifted into place on top of the pipe stand supplied by the contractor who was operating the LR-11350 super crane for the launch tower construction. In the center of this image viewed from above, there is a raised platform which workers would later place a laser total station like the one shown here by Starship Gazer. Laser total stations have a variety of uses, but in this case, they were doing everything they could to make these sections as level as possible and perfectly aligned with each other. A few weeks into the construction process, I actually decided to model this table myself using SolidWorks because at the time, a lot of people thought this was going to go on top of the high bay like some kind of space needle. I had to prove that this wasn't the high bay bar that Elon had in mind. So I got to work starting in the only place that makes sense, which was finding some reliable dimensions for these sections. In order to get the most accurate dimensions possible, it's good to use an object that you already know the dimensions of in order to calibrate your digital ruler. For this, I used the reflection tape shown on the side of the trailer when this section was being delivered. These reflective tape strips are regulated by the Department of Transportation, and I don't think you will ever see one inside of the United States that's anything other than exactly 2 inches tall. So using that as a reference, we were able to find the dimensions of everything else. And this is what you get. I'm pretty confident that these are accurate to within about 1/8 of an inch, if not more. From here, with a little bit of math, we can find the inner and outer dimensions of the table. The inner diameter is 38 feet and the outer diameter is 56.5 feet. Some of you might be annoyed that I'm using imperial units here while talking about rockets, but that's how this table is designed. Ships are designed in metric units, but all infrastructure is imperial. How do we know? Well, luckily, much later in the process of designing this table, I was able to get some confirmation of my digital measurements when I found every dimension I could possibly need written upside down on all of the outer panels thanks to Starship Gazer. Gotta give him a huge shout out because I had him DMing me pictures every single day on Discord so that I didn't miss a single update on this launch table.
This, my friends, is where Stage Zero Zach was born.
Alright, let's take a step back and return to the actual layout of this table. Where do the 3 different section types get placed in the pattern? You can see here that the common sections are bunched together in groups of 3, and then you have a left section next to a right section. I've highlighted the split sections here so they're easier to see. So why are these vertical supports added to the locations shown here? Well, the reason is pretty simple. It's because it has to align with the 6 columns sticking out of the ground at the launch site. Off first appearance, it might seem like these extensions onto the slanted columns are identical, but it helps when I add this in so you can see the difference a little bit better. These kind of look like 3 different emoji faces, and each face has a twin that's directly across from it. Anyways, if you haven't guessed by now, the blue columns line up with the RS sections, and the red ones line up with the LS. Here it is in my unfinished model from last year. When we zoom in a little on the left side of this image, there is an RS section which lines up with the gusset plate on the left column. These gusset plates are much further apart from each other than the ones located on the C sections shown on the right side. On the interface of the ring, you can see where the table aligns with the emoji face plate on top of the leg extension once it's mounted. With this background info out of the way, we can get into how this thing is actually assembled and what is going to be different on the new launch mount. Here is what SpaceX is going to do in order to complete this in a fraction of the time it took to do the first one, while minimizing the work that needs to be done at the launch complex. Anyways, once the 10 table sections are joined together, we're left with a 20-sided shape on both the inner and outer edges. So why would SpaceX choose such a complicated 20-sided shape in its design? Well, that's because there's 20 Raptor engines on the outer ring of the Super Heavy booster. So there's one wall for every engine. Moving on, the first thing crews did after everything was leveled out was to fill in this huge chamfered gap in between each section. They performed this same weld all the way around 10 separate times. This is not a fast weld either. Remember, the bottom plate is 1.5 inches thick and the top is 2.5 inches. So each of these welds likely required at least 2 or 3 passes, if not way more. Some of you may have noticed that I didn't mention the thickness of the weld required for the back wall. Well, that's because this weld was a massive waste of time. It should have never happened, and I'm confident it didn't happen this time around. The reason I say this is because a few weeks later, after all 10 sections were fully welded together, as you can see here in the aerial view, SpaceX workers went and deleted 1/3 of the work they had spent close to a month and a half performing. Basically, the wall shown here in between the 2 center vertical plates, which is highlighted in red, was removed, along with the 2 walls on the outer edge of the section, which are the 2 that I mentioned were a waste of time to weld. The other is out of sight in this image. In my opinion, the first OLM was rushed pretty drastically, mainly due to previously agreed upon rental time period for the LR-11-350 Super Crane, which allegedly had another job lined up after leaving Starbase. I also believe that all 10 launch ring sections left the steel fabrication facility before they were ready. Walls we saw removed after the welding process most likely never existed in the first place on the new table sections. Either that, or they were cut out before they ever left the fabrication shop. If this is true, I think we should be able to see it just a little bit in Harry Stranger's image thanks to this angle of the sun when the satellite passover took place. As you can see here, there is sunlight shining through the middle of each of these sections. Also, when you look at the left edge of the shadows, you would expect to see a straight line if the 2 outside walls were present. I think it's pretty clear here that these are not straight shadows, and I think it's safe to assume that the walls that I mentioned were in fact removed in advance. After these rectangular holes were cut out, nearly a month later, SpaceX workers made some additional cuts to the inner walls of the launch deck. These cutouts are to allow the top of the Super Heavy hold-down clamps to fit completely inside of the table once they retract. It can be seen here in this absolutely ridiculous image Starship Gazer captured at the perfect time on the perfect day. Keep in mind that what we are seeing here was several weeks after these cutouts were made. You can see the weld line where a backing plate, or I guess we should consider it a containment box, was added to the irregular shaped hexagonal cavity. This is what it looked like from behind. These things were not quick to weld on. I'm counting 7 individual welding passes here. You can see a little more clear in the render that I created last year with colors to separate the different surfaces. These 3 parts work together to create a barrier that stops excess methane and the superheated exhaust from the 300-meter long column of flames that's about to materialize out of nowhere from entering the table. The last thing you want is excess methane gas to combust inside the confined space of the table, especially if it ends up getting fully sealed on the outer walls like we were expecting. An explosion like this inside of the launch table would be catastrophic, especially because it runs the risk of quickly being followed by a secondary explosion if the high-pressure methane and gaseous oxygen pipes inside the table rupture and instantly combine 3,000 psi of oxidizer and fuel together. What I'm saying is, the launch deck itself has the potential to end up like the average Russian T-72 turret under the right conditions. This is only true if they decide to fully enclose it, as I mentioned earlier in the show. Also, this was a bit of an exaggeration, just to drive home the point of how important it is to seal up the inner face of the launch mount as much as possible. In reality, if SpaceX installed a skirt around this launch mount, it would extend out to enclose the crew access platform, which has a walkway formed from perforated panels. So it shouldn't ever be possible to build up enough pressure to cause that kind of damage, but it's a design consideration worth noting. Returning back to the point, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but we actually did find one single ground image of one of the 6 new upgraded common sections thanks to this post by David D on Twitter. If we zoom into the bottom right corner, you can just barely see that there appears to be a cutout made already for the hold down clamp containment cubbies. Man, I really wish we had a higher resolution version of this image. But shout out to David D for recognizing what he was seeing and pulling this image off of his dash cam. It's important to note that about the same time that the storage cubbies for the hydraulic clamps were being cut out and filled, additional crews were simultaneously performing extremely difficult core drilling on the inside of the table for the hinges of the hold-down arms. You can just barely see the completed hole for the clamp number 9 shown right here. If SpaceX wanted to shave off another month of drilling these holes into the table, then I would imagine that these holes came pre-drilled on the new OLM sections in Florida. Unfortunately, we're unable to see those holes. If this picture had been taken just a few milliseconds later, we probably would have gotten a good view of the hinge positions. Who knows? Maybe David has some more footage on his dash cam that we could subpoena for future investigations. Once these holes are drilled, the very next step is probably to sleeve them and then start mounting the clamps. With that being said, if you were to walk into Hangar X right now, I'm pretty sure that this is exactly what you would see. All 20 clamps should be mounted into the table by now. After all, the clamps were one of the first pieces on the second launch mount to be fabricated. How do I know this? Well, if we return to the image shown previously from RGV Ground Reel, you can see that these clamps are actually numbered. From left to right, we have 10, 29, 28, and 27. Last time I checked, there were only 20 clamps. I think it's safe to say that SpaceX had at least 40 of these made, if not 60 or even 80, when they constructed the first table. The reason I say this is because anybody who watches the RGV Aerial weekly Starbase updates will already know that SpaceX has a few spares left over at Starbase. We first spotted these about 2 months ago when they were moved out of the ground fabrication building. Looking at them again from the ground, you can see that these do appear to be an older pair, but that's probably just cosmetic. I'm sure she'll buff out just fine when the call to duty is received.
Wow, this episode got a lot longer than I expected it, but I guess I should have anticipated that because this is a lot of information to cover. So I will likely keep you guys updated on the status of the invisible launch mount in the future, depending on the feedback in the comments. If you guys would like to support CSI Starbase, you can now become a member of our YouTube channel, or you can find the link to our Patreon in the comments. For those of you who have supported us already, I want to give a huge thanks because we have already gone out of our way to make some really important updates to the studio, which should help us out a lot for future plans that we have on making these episodes even better. All right, with that being said, we'll see you guys next week. Stage 0 Zach out.